This is James Lupton for Round 8 Boxing. Delighted to be joined with Ben, the Bane Davis. Ben, how are you?
I'm fantastic, man. Great to be here. Thanks for having me on.
No, thank you for coming on. My pleasure, honestly. I got you on to talk about the influencer scene, Misfits. There's a hell of a lot going on at the moment. Firstly, I'm going to start with the probably the biggest fight in the new year coming up, and that's Tommy Fury, Darren Till. We saw you at a press conference recently. Just first of all, what do you make of that fight? It's obviously Darren Till's first boxing match, coming against somebody who is experienced in Tommy Fury in the boxing ring. What do you make of that fight?
Yeah, I think it's the definition of crossover combat, taking guys from extremely different backgrounds and setting them loose upon each other. Tommy is very decorated, obviously comes from a royal bloodline within boxing, and Darren's a former UFC title challenger. So he is going to be able to present some problems that maybe other guys that Tommy's fought hasn't. And the beauty of crossover and specifically X Series is we allow an ecosystem and an environment for these types of bouts to play out. So it's going to be a very interesting one. I think Darren's up against the wall here. This is, like you mentioned, his I believe second boxing bout. First one was kind of a sham, so we can just disregard that completely. But I don't know. I think that there is a world in which he can somehow pull this off. But man, yeah, odds are stacked against him.
That's it. You mentioned it's his second fight. I mean, I don't think even Darren would count the first one as a real fight because it was wild. In terms of experience, obviously Darren is inexperienced in terms of boxing, but in terms of caliber of opponent, he's fought, elite fighters, world level fighters in the UFC. Is that going to sort of make up for the inexperience in boxing?
Not from a technical angle, I don't think. Boxing, it's called the sweet science, right? There is a formula. There is a entire level of knowledge. I mean, shit, you need a PhD to capture a WBC, WBO title, right? So I think that in the technical sense, his prior oppositions, not really going to play into effect. But when it comes to battling tough people, battling veterans of combat sports, I think there is an element in there. Darren's not at all afraid of Tommy Fury. Right. There is not an element of him going in here and being wide eyed and the bright lights of what's going to happen in Manchester at the Co-op Arena. It's not going to phase Darren at all. So, like, that is the X factor he brings into this, right? The bouts with Whitaker, the title fight that he had, the I think 4 or 5 main events he's had. This is not a moment that's bigger than Darren Till. But I do think that this is an opponent who has had so many years in a discipline that Darren simply hasn't. And so, even though Darren's fought the elite of the elite at welterweight and middleweight within the UFC, I still believe on a technical edge he is quite far behind, just on paper.
And in terms of the build up, the promotion of the fight itself, obviously with Tommy, you got John Fury there who will essentially be his mouthpiece, and we saw that at a press conference. But that's not something that Darren's going to shy away from. Darren will thrive in that environment as well.
Mhm.
Does that potentially make this one of the biggest fights in influence boxing and misfit boxing history?
100%. Yeah, I mean, when you think about Tommy Fury, he's the consensus king of crossover combat, wins over Jake Paul, wins over KSI. In my estimation, that does place him in that top spot. And for Darren Till, right, he's so heavily decorated and has such a, I would say, carved out legacy within British combat sports that this is the biggest that we can offer, especially to kick off the new year. I mean, this is how we choose to start 2025, which I think is a big statement to the rest of the combat sports world. I think some people might reserve the big shows until the middle, later parts of the year, but we're like, fuck it, January 18th. we can't get bigger and better than this. And it's a stacked card as well, like what Turkey's doing. I just saw that February card get announced, and it's just banger after banger after banger. January 18th, the main event obviously is Fury Till, but there are many main attractions, I would say, for that card to make it pretty worthwhile for everybody to tune in.
No, absolutely. You mentioned obviously it's the biggest fight that can be made at the moment, but in terms of incentive for both these men, it sounds like
Mhm.
winner will go on to KSI. Now, when obviously Tommy has already fought KSI and beaten him, so for KSI, he will be looking to seek revenge, and for Darren, he'll be looking at the probably the biggest payday in Misfits boxing in terms of KSI. So there's a big carrot being dangled there for both men as well.
I completely agree with you. Yeah, there is a lot that hangs in the balance here. And, part of me looks at Tommy Fury's track and goes, well, what does he have to really prove? Guy's beaten both of the top dogs in crossover combat and made millions doing it, has the reality TV backing. There's really not much I would say that I could say he has to gain from these scenarios outside of just lapping the competition. For Darren, I do think there's an element of some retribution, some redemption. His combat sports career, I think, dovetailed in pretty tough fashion and coming up short in the ways that he did, especially with how he looked in some of those losses. There to me, I would say, it's more important to him to go out there and have a great performance, regardless of what could be next. Darren Till earns a hell of a lot back with a win over Tommy Fury. With Tommy, you sort of question and say, well, this is charted territory. You've been here before. You've done this before. You've checked these boxes. With Darren, I think that there's just simply so much more to gain. But like you mentioned, for both gentlemen, if they go on to have a bout with KSI, I mean, shit, that's a lot of money.
Absolutely. In terms of Tommy Fury, I find it really interesting. I would consider myself as a boxing purist,
Mm,
rather than on the influencer side of things. And for Tommy, obviously, you mentioned the bloodline. You got his brother Tyson Fury, was the heavyweight champion of the world, and will be rematching Alexander Usyk. And he's been in the game a long, long time. And you talk of the Furies, and you align that with boxing. With Tommy, it looked like he had, this sort of road through boxing carved out from already from his brother and his brother's name. And he was always going to get the big promoters, always going to get the big shows, and probably going to main event quite early on in his career. But he decided to go over to the influencer side of things again very early in his career. Do you think? I mean, apart from obviously he's done it for financial gain, essentially, it's you
yeah.
could argue easier opposition than the traditional boxing route. But do you think that Tommy's almost sold out by going down the route of influencer boxing in terms of his family's traditional boxing way of life?
It's a good question. I think that whenever someone makes moves heavily influenced by the financial gain, it's easy to just stand there and go, you're selling out, you're breaking the mold of what is traditionally expected or the path that maybe many think that you should go upon. But at the end of the day, I mean, it's really nobody's call that matters more so than Tommy's. So, people could say selling out, people could say, hey, you're actually making the right calls, getting so much exposure on your career so early. If you fought tomato cans in the UK for another couple years, who the fuck is going to care, But here he is main eventing on these big platforms, getting the chance to fight some of the biggest names in combat sports, right? As funny as it is, and I do think it's quite comedic to some extent, Jake Paul and KSI are two of the biggest names in combat sports. So there is an element to which you could look at it and go, all right, well, some could say selling out, but some could just say making the smart moves business wise. And at the end of the day, that's kind of what life's about. So I don't know. I think to answer that one, I'd say doesn't fucking matter, but what Tommy Fury thinks.
You sort of come to my next point. I was going to flip it and say, well, actually, is it, business wise, the right thing to do? Because obviously, we know in
Mm,
boxing, it's a short career. You see some guys in boxing with a lot of potential and they come out of it with no money at all. So actually, he's securing his future and his family's future for his kids, etc. Probably a long way down the line as well by fighting over on the influencer side of things. So actually, it's
mm.
a smart thing to do for him.
Well, I think it's quite intelligent, and I'm not going to disparage Tommy in any way, shape, and form with this next thought, but there might be a reality in which he scouts around and goes, "Man, I don't know if I'll be able to achieve the same types of titles that my brother did in my weight classes, given talent, ability, whatever else. So this is probably just maybe the ceiling that he finds himself at. And I'm not saying that is. I mean, shit, he could go on and absolutely breeze through guys, find himself a mandatory contender, get a belt, right? That's absolutely plausible. But maybe there is an element to which he thinks, okay, the scene is the scene in the traditional boxing realm, and I'm just going to be able to squeeze the juice the most on this side of things, and that might influence his decision making. But either way, I agree. His future is secure. If it wasn't already secure, it's it's deeply secure now.